A powerful black police officer, known for his integrity and dedication, had his car sabotaged by a fellow officer, a racist who was determined to ruin his career and reputation. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism, this was a calculated attempt to set him up, to incriminate him, and make sure he'd be seen as just another bad cop who couldn't be trusted. But this wasn't just about tarnishing his image, it was about sending a message, a reminder of who held power and who didn't. The morning was supposed to be routine. As he was getting ready for work, his phone buzzed, an unexpected call. He answered, and the voice on the other end was cold, taunting, with an underlying tone of mockery. "You think you're better than the rest of US, don't you?" the voice said. Confused, he checked the number, but it was unlisted. "Watch yourself, hero. Things can go bad real quick out there." And with a click, the line went dead. Shaking off the odd warning, he left for work, not realizing that this would be the start of a nightmare. As he was driving through Baltimore, the car suddenly jerked, the brakes failing to respond, and before he could even react, the steering locked. Panic flooded his senses, but he managed to swerve and avoid an accident, pulling over to the side. When he stepped out, he immediately saw the damage. Someone had tampered with his car, but why? And more importantly, who? Later that day, his worst fears materialized. At the precinct, he was called in for an urgent meeting with Internal Affairs. He walked into the room, expecting a routine briefing, but what he found was far from it. Sitting there was the same officer who had given him problems before, the one who made snide remarks, subtle jabs about knowing his place, and who now had a smug grin plastered across his face. The officer had filed a report claiming to have found illicit substances hidden in the protagonist's car. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. How could this be happening? "Check your trunk," the officer sneered, his eyes gleaming with a sick sense of satisfaction. "Bet you didn't think you'd get caught, did you?" Heart pounding, he opened the trunk, and there it was, a stash of drugs, conveniently placed right where anyone could find it. The room went silent, and he could feel every gaze burn into him, judgment, disappointment, disgust. The officer leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "People like you, thinking you can rise above, thinking you're untouchable. You're just proving that all you are is a fraud." The protagonist felt a mixture of anger, shock, and sheer helplessness. He knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about taking him down, it was a deliberate, calculated move to disgrace him, to make sure that everyone in the department, and beyond, would see him as a failure. But more than that, it was about control, about making sure he understood that no matter how good he was, how clean his record, he would always be seen as less. Days turned into weeks, and as the investigation dragged on, the pressure intensified. Gossip spread like wildfire, whispers in the hallway turned into full-blown conversations about how the rising star had fallen. Every news outlet was eager to report on the case of the black officer under suspicion, and it felt like the entire city was watching, waiting to see him fail. They wanted a story, and it was already written, another cop exposed, another scandal, and this time, it was even juicier because of who he was. As he sat at home, suspended from duty, he replayed every moment in his head, trying to piece together where things had gone wrong. He'd always been careful, always played by the rules. But no matter how hard he tried, it was like the game was rigged from the start. The phone calls became more frequent, each more menacing than the last. "You should have kept your head down. This is what happens when you think you can be more." Every time he heard that voice, he was reminded of the invisible chains that still bound him, no matter how high he climbed. But the thing is, he wasn't one to back down. He knew he had to find out who set him up, and why. With each passing day, the desire for answers burned hotter inside him. He began his own investigation, reaching out to people he trusted, digging through files, retracing his steps. Slowly, he began to uncover something bigger, a network of corruption, lies, and a conspiracy that was much deeper than just planting drugs in a car. It was a system designed to keep people like him from succeeding, from rising above their place. But just as he was starting to connect the dots, he was called back in. They'd found new evidence, they said. Evidence that could either clear his name or bury him completely. And then, a shocking revelation, something so unexpected that it had the power to turn the entire situation on its head. What he uncovered next didn't just expose the officer who set him up, it revealed a web of deceit that ran through the department, threatening to unravel everything they thought they knew. As he stared down his accuser, one final time, he realized that this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about bringing the truth to light, no matter how dangerous that might be. But the question remained, would the system that worked so hard to break him down allow the truth to come out? Or would they find a way to silence him, once and for all? What happens when someone who's been pushed to the edge decides to push back? When the system tries to bury you, but you find a way to dig yourself out? The truth is coming, and it's going to shock everyone. Stay tuned to find out how this story of injustice, betrayal, and resilience unfolds. Because sometimes, when you think you're just another piece on the board, you realize you've been holding all the cards. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I just want to take a moment to say something important. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or prejudice. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of community, and we're committed to creating a space where everyone feels heard and respected, especially our Black brothers and sisters who continue to fight for equality every single day. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a powerful story. And if you enjoy what we do here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Enjoy the story. Baltimore had always been a city of contrasts, vibrant yet worn, full of history but scarred by conflict. The streets pulsed with life, a mix of cultures, languages, and dreams, but there was also an undercurrent of tension, a reminder that not everything was as it seemed. It was here, in this city, that Marquis Allen had built his career. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm but commanding presence, Marquis was known throughout the department for his unwavering sense of justice. He had been on the force for nearly a decade, and in that time, he had earned a reputation as one of the most dependable and respected officers in Baltimore. Marquis had joined the police force with a clear purpose. Growing up in West Baltimore, he had seen firsthand how communities like his were often left vulnerable, ignored, and even targeted. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes whenever sirens blared nearby, and the way his friends' faces would harden at the sight of a police cruiser. He wanted to change that. To be the kind of officer who protected his community, not one who preyed on it. His rise through the ranks wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but Marquis had something most others didn't, an unshakable integrity, a belief that the badge he wore meant more than just authority, it meant responsibility. Despite his accomplishments, Marquis's path had not been without its share of obstacles. Being one of the few black officers in a predominantly white precinct came with its own set of challenges. There were subtle slights, like the way some of his colleagues would overlook him during discussions, or how they would exchange glances when he offered suggestions. There were also more overt acts of disrespect, but Marquis had learned to navigate these moments with a mix of patience and quiet strength. He knew he had to be twice as good to be seen as just as capable, and he had accepted that burden long ago. Yet, there was one person who made sure that burden never became lighter, Officer Ethan Price. Ethan had been with the Baltimore Police Department even longer than Marquis. He was the kind of cop who was always just one step shy of controversy, with a history of complaints that never seemed to stick. To those who didn't know him, he appeared as a dedicated, no-nonsense officer, but those who worked closely could sense the quiet malice in his actions. He had a way of making his disdain felt without ever saying it outright, a way of manipulating situations to his advantage. And for reasons Marquis could never quite understand, Ethan had always seemed to have a problem with him. It started small, backhanded compliments, sarcastic remarks, but over time, the hostility grew. There was a promotion coming up, a chance for Marquis to move into a leadership position he had worked tirelessly to earn. It was the kind of role that would allow him to make real changes, to bridge the gap between the community and the force. Ethan knew this, and it gnawed at him. To him, Marquis represented everything he despised, a black man rising through the ranks on merit, gaining respect from his peers, and challenging the old ways of doing things. Ethan had seen officers like Marquis before, and he knew just how to bring them down. Marquis had been preparing for the interview, going over strategies and plans, when he began to notice strange things. It was subtle at first, but then it became harder to ignore. The odd glances from colleagues, the whispers that would abruptly stop when he entered a room, even the way some of the senior officers started avoiding him. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Then came the phone call, an anonymous voice warning him to be careful, that there were people who didn't want to see him succeed. Marquis brushed it off at first, thinking it was just someone trying to rattle him before the big day. He had no idea how true those words would turn out to be. Ethan, meanwhile, had been busy. He had seen an opportunity to rid himself of Marquis once and for all, and he seized it with relish. He knew Marquis's routine, knew which car he drove and where he parked. It didn't take much to tamper with the vehicle, just a few quick adjustments to make it unsafe, but not obvious enough to draw immediate suspicion. Ethan's plan was simple: make it look like Marquis was reckless, like he was unfit to serve, and let the scandal right itself. But he wasn't done. A few days before the incident, he planted drugs in the trunk of Marquis's car, then filed an anonymous tip claiming that a member of the force was involved in illegal activities. All he had to do now was wait. The morning of the incident, Marquis left his house early, determined to clear his head before the big day. But as soon as he started driving, he knew something was wrong. The car swerved, the brakes barely responded, and he had to struggle to get it under control. Heart pounding, he managed to pull over, only to discover the evidence of tampering. It was a terrifying experience, but Marquis's focus quickly shifted from fear to anger. Someone had done this, and they had done it deliberately. He reported the issue, thinking that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. But instead, he was pulled aside by internal affairs and informed that there had been a report about drugs found in his vehicle. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Marquis was stunned, but he knew what this was. It was a setup, a way to destroy everything he had worked for. He tried to explain, to protest, but the officers listened with cold, indifferent expressions. It was like speaking to a wall. Then Ethan appeared, standing at the back of the room, arms crossed and a slight smirk on his face. "Guess you're not as clean as you thought, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Marquis felt his hands tremble, not with fear but with a rage he had never felt before. He could see the satisfaction in Ethan's eyes, the twisted pleasure of watching him struggle. This wasn't just about sabotaging his car, it was about dismantling his life piece by piece, and Ethan was enjoying every moment of it. But as Marquis looked around the room, at the faces that once held respect and now showed doubt, he made a silent promise to himself. He would find out who was behind this, and he would make sure they paid for what they did. The stage was set. Ethan thought he had everything under control, but Marquis wasn't going to let him win that easily. There was more at stake than just a job. This was about proving who he was, and no setup, no matter how well crafted, would keep him down for long. Ethan had lit the fuse, but he had no idea what kind of fire he was about to start. The next few days felt like a blur for Marquis. Everything that he had spent years building seemed to be unraveling at a pace he couldn't control. His suspension came quickly, and along with it, a wave of rumors that swept through the department like wildfire. To many, it was shocking, to others, it was almost expected. "It's always the ones who act all high and mighty," someone had said, and Marquis heard those words repeated in whispers and mutters, from the precinct halls to the streets of Baltimore. It felt like the walls were closing in, and he could barely breathe. But beneath the shock and betrayal was a simmering resolve. Marquis knew he was innocent, and if there was any way to clear his name, he was going to find it. The first step was trying to understand how deep this setup went. Marquis wasn't naive, he knew that this couldn't have been done by just one person. There had to be others involved, pulling strings behind the scenes. He began by reaching out to people he trusted, officers who had known him long before the rumors started, community leaders who had seen him at work. But many were hesitant to speak up. It was as if a shadow had been cast over everything, and everyone was afraid of what might happen if they got involved. It was during one of these quiet, desperate nights that Marquis got a call from someone he hadn't expected, Sergeant Harper, a veteran in the department who had always kept to himself, never one to pick sides. "I don't have long to talk," Harper's voice was low, cautious. "But I want you to know, not everyone's buying this. There are people who see what's happening, and they're not okay with it." Marquis felt a flicker of hope, but Harper's next words brought it crashing down. "Be careful, Alan. They're not just trying to discredit you, they want to bury you. And they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't get back up." Marquis thanked him and hung up, but the warning echoed in his head. He had to be smarter, quicker, and more cautious than ever. He decided to dig deeper, to find any scrap of evidence that could prove his innocence. He spent hours poring over documents, retracing his steps, trying to find a thread to pull that would lead him to the truth. And slowly, he began to see a pattern: files that had been altered, reports that had been conveniently misplaced, and connections between officers that didn't make sense. Someone was manipulating the system, bending it to their will, and all signs pointed back to the same place, Ethan Price. But confronting Ethan directly was risky. Marquis knew that if he made a move too soon, it could backfire, and he'd lose whatever leverage he had. Instead, he chose a different approach. He reached out to Vanessa, an old friend who worked in IT at the department. They had trained together when they first joined, and she had always been sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal. If anyone could help him dig up information without raising suspicion, it was her. Vanessa agreed to meet him at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The place was quiet, almost empty, and the sound of the rain outside made it feel even more isolated. When she arrived, her expression was a mix of concern and determination. "I'm going to be honest with you, Marquis. I don't know how much I can do without drawing attention, but I'll try." She slid a small flash drive across the table. "I've been looking into the security footage from the day they found the drugs in your car. There's a gap, about 15 minutes, where the cameras just happened to stop recording. I don't think it's a coincidence." Marquis took the flash drive, his hands shaking slightly. "So, they're covering their tracks," he said, more to himself than to her. "I need more than this, Vanessa. Something concrete. If there's a way to prove that Ethan or someone else tampered with my car, I can clear my name." She nodded, her eyes serious. "I'll see what I can find. But be careful, okay? If they find out you're digging around, it's only going to get worse." Leaving the diner that night, Marquis felt a mix of hope and dread. He had a lead, but he also knew that every step forward brought new risks. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The following week, Marquis decided to confront Ethan, but not in the way he originally planned. He needed to get close enough to see if Ethan would slip up, say something he shouldn't. So, he showed up at the precinct, acting as if he was just there to gather his belongings. As soon as he walked in, the room went silent. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. Ethan was there, standing by the coffee machine, looking as smug as ever. "Well, if it isn't our golden boy," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you'd be hiding out somewhere, waiting for this whole mess to blow over." Marquis forced a smile, even though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not hiding, Ethan. I'm just here to tie up some loose ends." He moved closer, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "But you know as well as I do that this isn't over. I'm going to find out who did this, and when I do, they're going to pay." Ethan's smile faltered for a moment, and Marquis saw a flash of something, fear, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You've got guts, Alan, I'll give you that. But you're playing a dangerous game, and you don't even know the rules. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. Walk away, while you still can. You think you're fighting for justice, but all you're doing is digging your own grave. Marquis didn't flinch. Maybe. But at least I'm not a coward who hides behind lies and sabotage. He could see the anger flare up in Ethan's eyes, and for a moment, it felt like they were back on equal footing, two sides of a coin that would never be the same. This isn't a game, Ethan. This is my life. And I'm not going to let you take it away from me. The tension between them was electric, but Ethan quickly regained his composure. You're out of your depth, Alan. There are people in this department who don't want you here, and they're not going to let you ruin everything they've built. You think this is just about you and me? It's bigger than that. Marquis left the precinct that day with more questions than answers. Ethan's words echoed in his head, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. But he knew one thing for sure, there was more at play here than just a personal vendetta. The setup, the sabotage, the cover-up, it was all part of a larger scheme, and if he was going to clear his name, he needed to find out who was pulling the strings. As the days passed, Marquis continued to dig, but the deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. He could feel the pressure building, like a storm gathering on the horizon, and he knew that whatever was coming next would change everything. There was a truth hidden beneath all the lies, a truth that could either save him or destroy him. And when it finally came to light, it was going to shock everyone. Marquis sat in his car, staring at the flash drive Vanessa had given him. It felt small and insignificant in his hand, but he knew that what it contained could be his lifeline. He inserted it into his laptop, eyes scanning the files that popped up on the screen. Among the usual data, there was one folder that stood out, correspondence logs, encrypted but not impossible to crack. As he started sifting through the information, his heart raced. If he was going to find anything that could connect Ethan to the setup, it had to be here. A few hours later, in the dim light of his apartment, he found it, a series of emails between Ethan and another officer, Sergeant Willis, disposing of a problem. The language was vague, but it was clear what they were talking about. They referenced shifts, parking spots, and the delivery, and it all pointed to the night Marquis' car had been sabotaged. One email, in particular, made Marquis' stomach drop. It's all set. If he tries to dig, we'll make sure he doesn't have anything to come back to. Marquis knew this was his chance. He needed more, something concrete to prove Ethan's involvement beyond a shadow of a doubt. He reached out to Vanessa again, asking her to meet him. This time, they agreed on a small cafe near the inner harbor, a place bustling enough to avoid drawing attention. When she arrived, her eyes were wary, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be watching. Marquis, you need to be careful, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. They're covering their tracks, and they're doing it fast. Whatever you're planning, you better move quick, because they won't give you many more chances. I found something, he said, pulling out the flash drive. Emails between Ethan and Willis. They're talking about setting me up, but it's all coded. We need something more explicit, something that shows they planted the drugs. Vanessa hesitated, biting her lip. There might be a way, but it's risky. I can try to access the internal server logs, see if there's any evidence that they tampered with the records or manipulated the security footage. But if they catch on, I'll take care of that, Marquis said, his voice firm. I need you to get me whatever you can. I'm not letting them destroy me without a fight. Over the next few days, the tension continued to build. Marquis felt like he was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into the abyss Ethan had prepared for him. He barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of how to expose the truth. Then, late one night, his phone buzzed. It was Vanessa, and her message was brief, meet me tomorrow, 8 a.m. I found something. They met at a park, the morning sun casting long shadows on the ground. Vanessa's face was pale, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a nervous energy. They erased most of the logs, she said, handing him a small stack of printed papers. But I found something they missed. A record of Willis accessing the evidence room the night before they found the drugs in your car. He wasn't supposed to be there, Marquis. And there's no reason for him to be in that part of the building unless he was planting something. Marquis scanned the papers, his pulse quickening. This was it, the proof he needed to show that the drugs were planted, that this was a setup orchestrated by Ethan and his accomplices. But even with this, he knew it wouldn't be enough to clear his name unless he could make it public, and that meant confronting Ethan head-on. That evening, Marquis walked into the precinct, holding the papers like a shield. Every eye in the room turned toward him, and he could feel the weight of their scrutiny. But he wasn't here to play defense anymore. He was here to end this. He made his way to Ethan's office, pushing the door open without knocking. Ethan looked up, surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced by a smirk. "Well, if it isn't Baltimore's most famous suspect," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "I thought you'd be long gone by now, licking your wounds." "I'm not going anywhere," Marquis said, dropping the papers on the desk. "I know what you did, Ethan. And I have the proof." Ethan glanced at the documents, not even bothering to pick them up. "You think a few papers are going to change anything? No one's going to listen to you, Alan. You've been discredited. Your word means nothing." "Maybe not on its own," Marquis said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. You made a mistake, Ethan. You thought you could manipulate the system without leaving any trace, but you're not as careful as you think. I have emails, records, everything I need to expose what you've done. And when this comes out, it's not just your job on the line. You'll be facing charges." Ethan's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand how things work around here. You think the people above me care about you, about justice? They don't. They'll protect their own, and you'll be left with nothing. Just walk away, Marquis. You don't have to go down with this." "I'm not the one going down," Marquis said, his voice rising. "I've spent my whole life fighting for what's right, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else take that away from me. If you want to bury me, you're going to have to do it in the open, where everyone can see. And I don't think you're ready for that." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Then Ethan stood up, his jaw clenched. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're still just one man against an entire system. You can't win." "Maybe not," Marquis said, meeting his gaze. "But I'm not alone. And I'm not afraid of you." The following day, Marquis arranged a meeting with Internal Affairs. He laid out everything he had, from the records Vanessa had found to the emails that linked Ethan and Willis to the setup. As he spoke, he could see the skepticism on their faces slowly shifting to concern. They knew this wasn't just a simple case of misconduct, this was a conspiracy that went far beyond what they were prepared to handle. But Marquis didn't stop there. He reached out to a local journalist who had been following the case, someone who wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions. He handed over copies of the evidence, along with a statement explaining everything that had happened. If the system wasn't going to protect him, then he would take his story to the public. The article came out 2 days later, and it was explosive. Headlines screamed about corruption within the Baltimore Police Department, and the names Ethan Price and Sergeant Willis were plastered across every screen. People were angry, demanding answers, and suddenly, Ethan found himself in the very spotlight he had tried to avoid. Marquis watched the fallout from a distance, knowing that this was only the beginning. He had forced their hand, and now they had no choice but to address the accusations. But there was one final piece left to play, and it came when Ethan was called in for questioning by Internal Affairs. Marquis was there, waiting, as Ethan was escorted into the room. "What's the matter, Price?" Marquis said, his tone calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "You don't look so confident now." Ethan didn't respond. For the first time, there was no smirk, no clever retort. He was silent, his face pale as he was confronted with the evidence laid out before him. The emails, the security logs, the witness statements, it was all there, undeniable and damning. And as internal affairs pressed him, the truth began to spill out. Ethan tried to shift the blame, to claim that he was just following orders, but it was too late. The web he had woven had finally caught up to him, and there was no escape. Marquis felt a sense of relief, but it was mixed with something else, something darker. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about justice, and about making sure that Ethan and everyone else involved paid for what they had done. As he left the room, he knew that the battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The city was watching, and they were ready to see the truth. But what Marquis didn't know was that there was still one final twist left, one last revelation that would turn everything on its head and force everyone to confront a truth that was even more shocking than they could have imagined. The stage was set, and the real fight was just beginning. The news of the investigation into Ethan Price spread through the department like wildfire. Officers whispered in the hallways, some in disbelief, others with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Ethan had always been untouchable, a figure who thrived on intimidation and manipulation. But now, with the spotlight turned on him, he was just another man, vulnerable and exposed. Marquis could see the cracks forming, and he knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. But as satisfying as it was to see Ethan squirm, there was still more to be done. Internal Affairs had set up a formal hearing to confront Ethan and Sergeant Willis. They had no choice now but to address the mounting evidence. Marquis was invited to attend, not as a defendant, but as a key witness. He arrived at the precinct early, the familiar setting feeling strangely foreign. As he walked down the corridors, he could feel the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some curious, and a few still full of doubt. But he didn't care. Today wasn't about proving himself anymore, it was about bringing down the people who had tried to destroy him. The hearing room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, his usual smug expression replaced by a look of barely concealed anxiety. Beside him, Sergeant Willis fidgeted nervously, glancing around as if searching for an escape. Marquis took his seat, facing them, and for a moment, their eyes met. Ethan's gaze was cold, but Marquis could see the fear lurking beneath it. As the proceedings began, the lead investigator, Lieutenant Green, stood and addressed the room. "We are here today to discuss serious allegations of misconduct, evidence tampering, and conspiracy within the department. The evidence presented includes internal communications, witness testimonies, and security logs. We will hear statements from all parties involved, beginning with Officer Marquis Allen." Marquis took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew this was his chance, not just to clear his name, but to make sure everyone saw the truth. "For weeks, I've been accused of crimes I didn't commit," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've been suspended, questioned, and treated like a criminal by people I thought were my colleagues. But I didn't come here today to defend myself. I came to expose the truth about what's been happening in this department." He pulled out the copies of the emails and security logs, laying them on the table for everyone to see. "These documents show that Ethan Price and Sergeant Willis conspired to plant drugs in my car, sabotage my vehicle, and frame me for crimes I had no part in. They did this because they saw me as a threat, someone who didn't fit their narrative, someone they couldn't control." Lieutenant Green picked up the documents, flipping through them. "These are serious accusations, Officer Allen. Are you prepared to stand by them?" Marquis nodded. "I am. And I have more than just paperwork. I have witnesses who can testify to the manipulation, to the intimidation tactics used by Ethan and others to silence anyone who got in their way." The room was silent as Green turned to Ethan. "Officer Price, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Ethan leaned forward, his expression hardening. This is ridiculous, he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. You're really going to take the word of a disgraced officer over years of service and loyalty? This is nothing but a desperate attempt to save his own skin. You've been silent about your involvement until now, Officer Price, Green said, his tone calm but firm. If there is another explanation for this evidence, we'd like to hear it. Ethan hesitated, and for a moment, Marquis thought he might try to deny everything. But then Ethan's demeanor shifted, a flicker of confidence returning to his eyes. Fine, he said, leaning back in his chair. You want the truth. The truth is that Marquis Allen is a liability. He's been a thorn in the side of this department for years, always trying to act like he's better than everyone else, like he's above the law. We did what we had to do to protect this department from someone who doesn't know how to play by the rules. The room erupted in murmurs, shocked gasps mixing with angry whispers. Marquis felt his stomach turn, but he forced himself to stay calm. So you admit it, he said, his voice rising. You admit that you tried to set me up because you couldn't stand the idea of someone like me succeeding? I admit, Ethan said, his lips curling into a sneer, that I did what was necessary. This department doesn't need people like you, people who think they can come in and change everything. You were a problem, and I solved it. Lieutenant Green raised a hand to silence the room, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Ethan. Do you understand what you've just confessed to, Officer Price? You've admitted to conspiracy, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. These are criminal offenses. Ethan's confidence faltered, his smirk slipping as he realized the gravity of what he had just said. Wait, enough, Green said sharply. We've heard more than enough. Sergeant Willis, do you have anything to add? Willis, who had been silent up to this point, looked like a man on the edge of collapse. I didn't want to get involved, he stammered, his voice barely audible. Ethan told me it would be easy, that no one would ever find out. He said we just had to make sure Marquis didn't get the promotion, that it was for the good of the department. I never wanted to. Marquis felt a wave of anger and pity wash over him. Willis had been weak, but it was Ethan who had orchestrated everything. Ethan who had taken advantage of the system, of people's fears and insecurities, to get what he wanted. And now, he was watching it all fall apart. Lieutenant Green stood, looking down at Ethan and Willis with a mix of disgust and disappointment. This hearing will conclude with the recommendation that both of you be placed on administrative leave pending a full criminal investigation. Officer Price, Sergeant Willis, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately. The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Ethan stood up, his face twisted in rage. You think this is over? He shouted, pointing at Marquis. You think you've won? You're nothing, Allen. This department will eat you alive, and when it does, I'll be there to watch. Marquis stood, meeting Ethan's gaze with a calm, unflinching stare. Maybe, he said quietly. But not today. As Ethan was escorted out of the room, his threats echoing down the hallway, Marquis felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had done it. He had exposed the truth, and now the people who had tried to destroy him were facing the consequences of their actions. But there was still more to be done. That evening, Marquis sat down with the journalist who had helped him bring the story to light. What happens next? She asked, her pen poised over her notebook. There's still so much we don't know. Who else was involved? How deep does this go? Marquis hesitated, thinking about everything he had uncovered, the hints of a larger conspiracy that went beyond Ethan and Willis. I'm not sure, he said finally. But I'm going to find out. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I owe it to every person who's been pushed aside, silenced, or set up because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what they should be. The journalist nodded, a determined gleam in her eyes. Then let's make sure the world hears your story, Marquis. As he walked out of the cafe, the night air cool against his skin, Marquis felt a sense of relief, but also a quiet resolve. The battle with Ethan was over, but the war was far from won. There were still people out there who would try to use their power to manipulate, to silence, to control. And as long as they existed, he would keep fighting. But for now, he had taken the first step. He had shown that even the most powerful could be brought down, that the truth could prevail, no matter how deeply it was buried. And as he stood there, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, but Marquis was ready. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control, like he could see a path forward. Because no matter how dark things got, he had learned one thing: there was always light at the end, as long as you were willing to fight for it. The fallout from Ethan's confession was immediate and explosive. News outlets across Baltimore and beyond ran with the story, each headline more damning than the last. Corruption scandal rocks BPD, read one. Police officers caught in conspiracy to frame colleague, blared another. For weeks, it seemed as if the city was talking about nothing else. Ethan Price and Sergeant Willis had become the faces of a scandal that had long been simmering beneath the surface, and now it was finally boiling over. Within the department, the atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a sense of long-awaited vindication. Officers who had once looked the other way or stayed silent were now coming forward, offering pieces of information that painted a clearer, and much darker, picture of the culture that had allowed Ethan to operate unchecked. Marquis watched as the walls he had spent so long pushing against began to crumble, and though he should have felt triumphant, there was an unease he couldn't shake. The consequences for Ethan and Willis were severe. They were immediately suspended without pay, their badges and guns taken away as they awaited formal charges. But the scandal didn't end with them. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that there were others involved, people who had quietly supported or turned a blind eye to what Ethan was doing, either out of fear or complicity. Marquis found himself caught in the middle of it all, no longer just a victim, but a reluctant symbol of resistance against a system that was now tearing itself apart. One afternoon, Marquis was called into a meeting with Lieutenant Green and Chief Harrington. As he entered the room, he could feel the tension, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. Green motioned for him to sit, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, Chief Harrington cleared his throat, his expression serious but not unkind. "Marquis, we owe you an apology," he began, his voice firm but measured. "You were put through hell, and it never should have happened. We failed you, and we failed this department by allowing people like Ethan Price to operate unchecked for so long. What you did, bringing this to light, took courage, and it's something we will not forget." Marquis nodded, his throat tight. "I appreciate that, Chief. But an apology isn't going to fix what's broken. Ethan and Willis aren't the only ones responsible. There's a culture here that allowed this to happen, and until that changes, it's only going to keep happening." Chief Harrington's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We understand that, and we're committed to making changes. But we need your help, Marquis. You've become a voice for something bigger than just this case. We want to put you in a position where you can help guide these reforms, help us rebuild trust within the community." Marquis felt a surge of conflicting emotions. This was what he had always wanted, a chance to make real, meaningful change. But the irony of it all was almost too much to bear. After everything he had been through, they were now asking him to be the face of the very institution that had tried to destroy him. "You want me to lead," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "After everything that's happened?" Green spoke up, his tone earnest. "Yes, we do. Because you've shown that you're willing to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you. We need someone like that. And if we're going to rebuild, we need to start by showing that we're willing to listen, to make amends." Marquis looked down at his hands, thinking about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about the fear, the anger, the nights spent wondering if he would ever be able to clear his name. But he also thought about the people who had supported him, who had helped him even when it was risky. He thought about Vanessa, about the community leaders who had reached out to him, about the officers who were now coming forward to tell their own stories. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to be a puppet. If you want me to be a part of this, then things need to change for real. No more cover-ups, no more excuses. We're going to address the problems head-on, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Chief Harrington nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Agreed. We'll support you in whatever way we can." As the meeting ended, Marquis felt a strange mix of empowerment and dread. He was being given a chance to reshape the very system that had nearly destroyed him, but he also knew how resistant to change it could be. The challenges ahead were immense, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was stepping into a battle that he would never truly win. Over the next few weeks, Marquis took on his new role, working alongside community leaders, activists, and other officers to draft a series of reforms. He pushed for greater accountability, transparency, and an overhaul of how misconduct was handled within the department. It was grueling work, full of long days and difficult conversations, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a difference. But as the reforms began to take shape, Marquis found himself facing a new dilemma, one that was far more personal. Ethan had been formally charged, and his trial was set to begin. During the pre-trial hearings, Marquis learned that Ethan's defense team was preparing to argue that he had been scapegoated, that the real corruption extended far beyond just him and Willis. They were planning to expose other officers, implicate higher-ups, and drag the entire department into the spotlight. It was a move that would cause chaos, and Marquis knew that if it happened, all the progress they had made could be undone. One evening, Marquis received a call from Ethan's lawyer, requesting a private meeting. Against his better judgment, Marquis agreed. They met at a small, quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of the media. When Ethan arrived, he looked different, defeated, tired, and strangely calm. It was a stark contrast to the arrogant, unflinching man Marquis had faced in the hearing room. "Why did you want to meet?" Marquis asked, keeping his tone neutral. Ethan sighed, looking down at his coffee. "I'm not here to make excuses, Marquis. I know what I did, and I'm going to pay for it. But before that happens, there's something you need to understand. You think this is over, but it's not. You've made enemies, and they're not going to let this go." "What are you talking about?" Marquis demanded, leaning forward. "What do you know?" "I'm talking about the people who let me do what I did," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones who gave me the green light to go after you, who told me to make sure you didn't get that promotion. They're still out there, and they're not happy about how things have turned out. If you keep pushing, they'll come after you. They'll come after everyone you care about." Marquis felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you trying to threaten me, Ethan?" "Because if you are, it's not a threat," Ethan interrupted, his eyes weary. "It's a warning. You're trying to change a system that doesn't want to change, and they're not going to let you. I'm already done for, but you still have a chance to walk away." Marquis stared at Ethan, searching for any hint of deception, but all he saw was a man who had finally run out of ways to fight. "You're asking me to back down," he said quietly. "To walk away from everything I've fought for, just to protect myself." "I'm asking you to think about what you're risking," Ethan replied. "I know you hate me, and I deserve that. But there's a bigger game at play here, and you're not going to win. You can try, but they'll find a way to make you disappear, just like they almost did before." For a moment, Marquis didn't know what to say. He had spent so long fighting for justice, for truth, but now he was being confronted with a reality that was far more complicated than he had imagined. If he continued to push, he would be putting himself and others in danger. But if he backed down, he would be betraying everything he stood for. You made your choices, Ethan, Marquis said finally, his voice steady. And now I'm making mine. I'm not walking away. I'm going to keep fighting, and if that means going up against people who are bigger than you, then so be it. Ethan shook his head, a sad, almost pitying smile on his face. I figured you'd say that. Just, be careful, Alan. You're stepping into a world where people don't play fair, and they don't like to lose. As Ethan left, Marquis sat alone, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He had come so far, but now he was faced with a choice that could change everything. He could see the path ahead, but it was dark, full of dangers he hadn't anticipated. And for the first time, he wondered if he was truly ready for what was coming. The trial against Ethan Price and Sergeant Willis became a spectacle that few in Baltimore would forget. As more details emerged, it was clear that their actions were just the tip of the iceberg. Witnesses came forward, sharing stories of intimidation, cover-ups, and a culture of silence that had permeated the department for years. The prosecution painted a picture of a deeply flawed system, one that had allowed officers like Ethan to operate without fear of consequences. But as the walls closed in on Ethan, he made one final, desperate move. On the first day of the trial, Ethan's defense team tried to shift the blame, claiming he was acting under orders from higher-ups who wanted to eliminate Marquis as a threat to their control. He revealed names, senior officers and officials who had backed him, provided resources, and ensured he wouldn't be caught. It was a risky strategy, but it worked. The court ordered a broader investigation, and suddenly, Ethan was no longer the main focus. The net was cast wider, ensnaring people who had thought they were untouchable. In the end, Ethan's attempt to save himself by implicating others didn't work out as he had hoped. The information he provided only confirmed what many had suspected for years, that there was a network of corruption, a system designed to protect certain people at any cost. Ethan was found guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and his last attempt at manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of saving himself, he had taken down everyone he had allied with, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Sergeant Willis, who had initially cooperated with the investigation, received a lighter sentence but still faced jail time. His remorse was evident during the trial, but it wasn't enough to absolve him of his role. I wish I had done things differently, he said during his final statement. I was afraid, and I thought following orders was the only way to survive. But that doesn't excuse what I did. He would be haunted by his choices for years, but at least he had a chance to start over once he had served his time. For Marquis, the resolution brought a mix of relief and a deeper sense of responsibility. The exposure of the corruption led to a massive overhaul within the Baltimore Police Department. Several senior officers were suspended, investigations were opened, and new policies were put in place to ensure greater transparency and accountability. Marquis played a central role in these reforms, his experiences shaping the way the department approached its relationship with the community. But his decision to continue pushing for change had not been without cost. There were moments when he felt the weight of what Ethan had warned him about, the whispers, the veiled threats, the knowledge that he was challenging something much larger than just one corrupt officer. Yet, every time he looked into the eyes of the people who had supported him, who had believed in him, he knew he had made the right choice. In recognition of his courage and dedication, Marquis was promoted, not just to a leadership role but to a position where he could directly oversee the implementation of the reforms he had fought so hard for. It was a victory, not just for him, but for every officer who had been silenced, for every community member who had felt powerless. He had set out to change the system, and while it was far from perfect, he had made a real, tangible difference. On his first day in his new office, Marquis sat down, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. He thought about the long journey that had brought him here, the fear, the anger, the moments when he had been on the verge of giving up. And he realized that this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. There would always be challenges, always be those who would try to resist change, but as long as he was here, he would keep fighting. Because he knew now, more than ever, that real change was possible. As for Ethan, his fate was a bitter irony. The man who had once believed he could manipulate the system to his will was now at its mercy, trapped behind bars, watching as the very structure he had tried to protect crumbled around him. He had underestimated Marquis, and in the end, he had lost everything. But perhaps the greatest punishment was knowing that his downfall had been of his own making, a consequence of his arrogance and greed. This story isn't just about one man's fight against corruption. It's about what happens when someone refuses to back down, even when the odds are stacked against them. Marquis Allen's journey shows us the power of resilience, of standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is trying to push you down. It's a reminder that change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come without sacrifice, but it is possible. How many times have we seen people try to silence those who speak out, to discredit those who dare to challenge the status quo? Marquis' story reminds us that silence isn't an option. That there will always be those who try to bend the truth to suit their own needs, but as long as there are people willing to stand up, to speak out, justice can prevail. What did you think of Marquis' story? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for what was right, even when it felt impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories, your experiences, and your reflections on this journey. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We bring you powerful, thought-provoking stories that challenge the norm and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and keep fighting for what's right.